Accordingly, after leaving a garrison in the fortress of Ramla and the new bishop, we loaded our camels and oxen, and then all our baggage animals and horses, and turned our march to Jerusalem. However, the word which Peter Bartholomew had commanded us, that we should not approach Jerusalem except with bared feet, we forgot and held in low regard, each one, from ambition to occupy castles and villas, wishing to go ahead of the next. For it was a custom among us that if any one came to a castle or villa first, and placed his standard there with a guard, it was touched by no one else afterward. Therefore, because of this ambition, they rose at midnight, and without waiting for companions, gained all those mountains and villas that were in the meadows of the Jordan. A few, however, to whom the command of God was more precious, walked with naked feet, and sighed heavily for the contempt of the divine world, and yet no one recalled a companion or friend from that ambitious chase. Moreover, when by such arrogant procedure we had come near Jerusalem, the people of Jerusalem came forth to meet the first of our men, and wounded the horses severely. Of those men 3 or 4 fell in that day, and many were wounded. Duke Godfrey and the Count of Flanders and the Count of Normandy besieged the city from the north side, that is, from the church of St. Stephen, located in the centre of the city, southward to the angular tower next to the Tower of David. Count Raymond and his army, however, settled down to the west and besieged Jerusalem from the camp of the Duke to the foot of Mount Zion. But since his men could not come close to besiege the wall because of a gully which intervened, the Count wished to move his camp and change his position. One day, while he was reconnoitring, he came to Mount Zion and saw the church which is located on the mount. When he heard of the miracles that God had performed there, he said to his leaders and companions, "If we neglect this sacred offering, with the Lord that has so graciously offered us, and the Saracens here occupy this place, what will become of us? What if, through hatred of us, they would destroy and pollute these sacred things? Who knows that God may not be giving us this opportunity to test our regard for him? I know this one thing for certain. Unless we carefully protect this sacred plot, the Lord will not give us the others within the city." And so Count Raymond, against the wishes of the leaders of his army, ordered his tents to be moved to that spot. As a result of this, he incurred such great hatred from his men that they neither were willing to camp with him or do guard duty during the night, each staying where he had first pitched his tent, with the exception of the few who accompanied the Count. However, by great rewards the Count daily induced knights and footmen to guard his camp. There are in that church these sacred treasures: the tombs of the kings, David and Solomon, as well as that of the first martyr, St. Stephen. There the Blessed Mary departed from this world. The Lord supped there, and after rising from the dead appeared there to his disciples and to Thomas. On this spot also the disciples were filled with the Holy Spirit. When the siege had been set, it happened one day that some of the leaders of the army met a hermit on the Mount of Olives, who said to them, "If you attack the city tomorrow till the 9th hour, the Lord will deliver it into your hands. But we do not have the necessary machinery for storming the walls." The hermit replied, "God is all-powerful. If he wills, he will storm the walls even with one ladder. The Lord awaits those who labor for the truth." So, with such machinery as could be constructed during the night, an attack was made on the city in the early morning, and it lasted until the 3rd hour. The Saracens were compelled to retreat behind the inner walls, for the outer was broken by our men, some of whom climbed to the top of the inner walls. Now when the city was about to be captured, in the confusion of desire and fear the attack was interrupted, and then we lost many men. On the next day no attack was attempted. After this, the whole army scattered throughout the surrounding country to collect provisions, and nothing was even said of the necessity of preparing the machines that were needed to capture the city. Each man was serving his mouth and stomach. What was worse, they did not even ask the Lord to free them from such great and manifold evils, and they were afflicted even unto death. Just before our arrival, the Saracens had filled up to the springs, destroyed the cisterns, dammed the brooks from the springs, and the Lord himself had turned rivers into wilderness and water springs into thirsty ground for the wickedness of them that dwell therein. Therefore water was obtained with great difficulty. There was a fountain at the foot of Mount Zion, which is called the Pool of Siloam. Indeed, it is a huge spring, but the water flows forth only once in 3 days, and the natives say that formerly it emptied itself only on Saturdays. The rest of the week it remained stagnant. We do not know how to explain this, except that the Lord willed it to be so. But then, as we have said, the water did flow forth on the 3rd day. It was consumed with such great crowding and haste that the men pushed one another into it, and many baggage animals and cattle perished in it. And so when the pool was filled with the crowd and with the bodies of dead animals, the stronger, even at the price of death, forced their way to the very opening in the rocks through which the water flowed, and while the weak got only the water which had already been contaminated. Many sick people fell down by the mountain, with tongues so parched that they were unable to utter a word, and with open mouths they stretched forth their hands forward to those who had water. In the field there were many horses, mules, cattle, and sheep, most of the animals without strength enough to move. And when they had become parched and died, because of extreme thirst, they rotted where they had long stood, and there was a most sickening stench throughout the camp. Because of such affliction it was necessary to fetch water a distance of 2 or 3 leagues, also to drive the cattle to distant watering places. When the Saracens noticed that our people were going unarmed to the watering places, through the dangerous passes in the hills, they lay wait for them in ambush. They killed many of them, and drove away the flocks and herds. The situation was so bad that when everyone brought foul water to the camp in vessels, any price that he cared to ask, and if anyone wished to get clear water for 5 or 6 nummi, he could not obtain enough to satisfy his thirst for a single day. Wine, moreover, was never, or very rarely, even mentioned. In addition, the heat, the dust, and the wind increased their thirst, as though this was not bad enough in itself. But why say so much about these troubles? None or few were mindful of the Lord, or of such work as was needed to capture the city. Nor they take heed to beseech the Lord's favour, and thus we not recognize God in the midst of our affliction, nor did he show favour to the ungrateful. Meanwhile, messengers came to camp, announcing that our ships had arrived at Joppa, and that the sailors demanded that a guard be sent to hold the tower of Joppa and to give them protection at the port, for the town of Joppa had been destroyed except the castle, that was nearly in ruins with the exception of one tower. However, there's a harbour there, and it is one nearest to Jerusalem, being about 1 day's journey distant. All of our people rejoiced when they heard the news of the ships, and they sent out Count Galidamar, surnamed Carpinellus, accompanied by 20 knights and about 50 footmen. Later they sent Raymond Piltus with 50 knights and William of Sabran with his followers. As Galdemar and his contingent approached the plains on his side of Ramla, they encountered a force of 400 chosen Arabs and about 200 Turks. Galdemar, because of the number of his men that was so small, arranged his knights and bowmen in the front ranks, and trusting in the Lord, advanced on the enemy without hesitation. The enemy, however, thought that they would be able to crush his band, and rushing upon them and shooting arrows they encircled them. 3 or 4 of Galdemar's knights were killed, including Archid of Montemel, a noble youth and renowned knight. Others were wounded, and all of our bowmen fell. However, many of the enemy were also killed. Nevertheless, the attack of the enemy did not slacken on account of all of this, nor did the courage of our knights. Nay, God's knights falter. Though oppressed by wounds and death itself, they stood up to their enemies all the more fiercely the more that they suffered from them. But when our leaders, further from weariness than from fear, were about to withdraw, a cloud of dust was seen approaching. Raymond de Saint Gilles was rushing headlong into the fight with his men. Moreover, his men raised so much dust that the enemy thought that there were many knights with him. Thus, by the grace of God, our men were delivered. The enemy scattered and fled. About 200 of them were killed, and much plunder was taken. It is the custom of this people, when they flee and are hard pressed by the enemy, first to throw away their arms, then their clothes, and lastly their saddle-bags. Thus it happened in this fight that our few knights continued killing the enemy until they were worn out, and they kept the spoils obtained from the rest, even of those whom they did not kill. After the pursuit was over, our men assembled, divvied up the spoils, and then marched to Joppa. The sailors received them with great joy, and felt so secure after their arrival that they forgot their ships and neglected to place watches on the sea, but entertained the Crusaders with a feast of bread, wine, and fish from their ships. The sailors, careless of their security, failed to post lookouts for the night, and in the darkness they were suddenly surrounded by enemies from the sea. When dawn came, they realized that the enemy was too strong to be resisted. They abandoned their ships, carrying only the spoils. Thus our knights returned to Jerusalem, after winning one battle and losing another. However, one of our ships, which had gone on a plundering expedition, was not captured. It was returning to port with the greatest plunder when it saw the rest of our ships surrounded by so great a fleet of the enemy. By the use of oars and sail it made its escape to Laodicea, and told our friends and companions of that port what had been happening to Jerusalem. We knew that we had deserved this misfortune, for we had refused to place faith in the words sent to us by the Lord. Despairing of God's mercy, the men went to the plain of the river Jordan, collected palms, and were baptized in its waters. They did so chiefly with the intention of abandoning the siege, having seen Jerusalem, and of going to Joppa, thence to return home by whatever means they could. But the Lord looked after the ships for his unfaithful. About this time a public assembly was held, for the leaders of the army were quarrelling with each other. There was dissatisfaction because Tancred had occupied Bethlehem and had placed his standard over the Church of the Nativity, as though it was an ordinary house. An effort was also made to elect one of the princes king to have custody of the city, lest what had been achieved in common could be destroyed in common for want of anyone to take care of the city, if God should give it to us. The bishops and clergy replied to his suggestion. "You ought not to choose a king where the Lord suffered and was crowned. For if a David, degenerate in faith and virtue, should say in his heart, 'I sit upon the throne of David and hold this kingdom,' the Lord would probably destroy him and be angry with place and people. Besides, the prophet proclaims, saying, 'When the Holy of Holies shall come, unction shall cease, because it will be manifest to all peoples that he has come.' But there should be an advocate to guard the city and divide the tributes and rents of the region among the guardians of the city." For this and many other reasons the election was stopped and put off until the 8th day after the capture of Jerusalem. Not in this matter alone, but in other ways, our affairs did not prosper, and the troubles of the people increased every day. Nevertheless, the merciful and propitious Lord, both for his name's sake and lest our enemies should insult his law and say, "Where is their God?" sent word to us through the Bishop of Puy, Lord Adhemar, how we should placate his anger and obtain his mercy. We, however, preached that this could be done without mentioning the command of God. lest if the people transgressed his command to the Lord, they would be especially afflicted, as they would then be more culpable. For the Lord was so kind to us that he had sent his messengers to us often, but because they were our brothers, we had not needed them. The bishop appeared before Peter Deserdius, saying, "Speak to the princes and all the people, and say to them, You who have come from distant lands to worship God, Lord of hosts, purge yourselves of your uncleanliness, and let each one turn from his evil ways. Then with bare feet march around Jerusalem invoking God, and you must also fast. If you do this, then make a great attack on the city on the 9th day, and it will be captured. If you do not, all the evils that you have suffered will be multiplied by the Lord." When the priest had said this to William Hugo, the brother of the bishop, to his lord, Count Yosard, and to certain of the clergy, they assembled the princes and the people and addressed them. "Brothers, you know why we undertook this expedition, and what we have suffered, and that we acting negligently in that we not constructing the machines that we needed to capture the city. Likewise, we are not careful to reconcile the Lord to us, for we offend him in many ways, and through our evil deeds have driven him from us. Now, if it seems right to you to let each one become reconciled to his brother whom he has offended, and let brother graciously forgive brother, after this let us humble ourselves before God. Let us march around Jerusalem in bare feet, and through the patronage of the saints invoke the mercy of the God, so that Almighty God, who for us his servants laid aside the form of his Godhead, assumed the flesh, and humbly rode through the city on an ass to suffer death on the cross for our sins, may come to our aid. If we make this procession around the walls, for the honour and glory of his name, we will open the city to us, and give us judgment upon his enemies and ours, who now, with unjust possession, contaminate this place of his suffering and burial, the enemy who seek to deny us the great blessing of the place of God's humiliation and of our redemption." These words were pleasing to both princes and people, and it was publicly commanded that on the next day the clergy would lead the procession with crosses and relics of the saints, while the knights and all able-bodied men with trumpets, standards, and arms should follow them barefooted. All this we did according to the commands of God and the princes. When we reached the plot of the Mount of Olives, whence the Lord had ascended to heaven after the resurrection, the following exhortation was made to the people. "Now that we are on the rise spot from which the Lord gave his ascension, and we can do nothing more to purify ourselves, let each one of us forgive his brother whom he has injured, that the Lord may forgive us." What more, all were reconciled to each other, and with generous offerings we besought the mercy of God, that we should not now desert his people, whom he had led so gloriously and miraculously to this goal. Thus the mercy of God was obtained, since everything that had been against us was now favourable. Although we have passed over many matters, this one we ought to record. While we marched around the city, Saracens and Turks also made the circuit on the walls, the procession, ridiculing us in many ways. They placed many crosses on the walls, in yokes, and mocked them with blows and insulting deeds. We in return, hoping to obtain the aid of God in storming the city by means of these signs, pressed the work of siege day and night. The Duke and Counts of Normandy and Flanders placed Gaston of Bière in charge of the workmen who constructed machines. They built mantlets and towers with which to attack the wall. The direction of this work was assigned to Gaston by the princes because he was the most noble lord, respected by all for his skill and reputation. He very cleverly hastened matters by dividing the work. The princes busied themselves with obtaining the material, while Gaston supervised the construction. Likewise, Count Raymond made William Racow superintendent of the work on Mount Zion, and placed the Bishop of Alborough in charge of the Saracens and others who brought in the timber. The Count's men had taken many Saracen castles and villages and forced the Saracens to work, as though they were their serfs. Thus, for the construction of machines at Jerusalem, 50 or 60 men carried on their shoulders a great beam that could have been dragged by 4 pair of oxen. All worked with a singleness of purpose. No one was slothful, no bands were idle. All worked without wages except the artisans, who were paid from a collection taken from the people. However, Count Raymond paid his workmen from his own treasury. Surely the hand of the Lord was with us, and aided those who were working. When our efforts were ended and the machines completed, the princes held a council and announced, "Let all prepare themselves for a battle on Thursday. In the meantime, let us pray, feast, and give alms. Hand over your animals and your boys to the artisans and carpenters, and they may bring in beams, poles, stakes, and branches to make mantlets. 2 knights should make 1 mantlet and 1 scaling ladder. Do not hesitate to work for the Lord, for your labours will soon be ended." This was willingly done by all. Then it was decided what part of the city each ladder should attack, and where his machine should be located. Meanwhile, the Saracens in the city, noting the great number of machines that we had constructed, strengthened the weaker parts of the wall, so that it seemed that they could be taken only by the most desperate efforts. Because the Saracens had made so many and such strong fortifications to oppose our machines, the Duke, the Count of Flanders, and the Count of Normandy spent the night before the day set for the attack, moving their machines, mantlets, and platforms to that side of the city which is between the church of St. Stephen and the valley of Josaphat. You who read this must not think that this was a light undertaking, for the machines were carried in parts almost a mile to the place where they were to be set up. When morning came and the Saracens saw that all the machinery and tents had been moved during the night, they were amazed. Not only the Saracens were astonished, but our people as well, for they recognized that the band of the Lord was with us. The change was made because the new point chosen for the attack was more level, and thus suitable for moving the machines up to the walls, which cannot be done unless the ground is level, and also because that part of the city seemed weaker, having remained unfortified, as it was some distance from our camp. This part of the city is on the north. Count Raymond and his men worked equally hard on Mount Zion, but they had much assistance from William Ibrico, the Genoese sailors who, though they had lost their ships at Joppa, as we have already related, had been able nevertheless to save ropes, mallets, pikes, axes, and hatchets, which were very necessary to us. But why delay the story? The appointed day arrived and the attack began. However, I want to say this first, that according to our estimate, and that of many others, there were 60,000 fighting men in the city, not counting the women and those unable to bear arms, and there were not many of these. At most, we did not have more than 12,000 able to bear arms, for there were many poor people and many sick. There were 12 or 1300 knights in our army, as I reckon it, not more. I say this that you may realize that nothing, whether great or small, which is undertaken in the name of the Lord can fail, as the following pages show. Our men began to undermine the towers and walls. From every side stones were hurled from the tormenti and the petrae, and so many arrows as they fell like hail. The servants of God bore this patiently, sustained by the premises of their faith, whether or not they should be killed, or should presently prevail over their enemies. The battle showed no indication of victory, but when the machines were drawn nearer to the walls, they hurled not only stones and arrows, but also burning wood and straw. The wood was dipped in pitch, wax, and sulphur, when straw and tow were fastened on by an iron band. and when lighted, these firebrands were shot from the machines. They were all bound together with an iron band, I say, so that whenever they fell, the whole mass held together and continued to burn. Such missiles, burning as they shot upward, could not be resisted by swords or by high walls. It was not even possible for the defenders to find safety behind the walls. Thus the fight continued from the rising and setting sun in such splendid fashion that it is difficult to believe anything more glorious was ever done. Then we called on mighty God, our leader and guide, confident in his mercy. Night brought fear to both sides. The Saracens feared that we would take the city during the night, or on the next day, for the outer works were broken through, and the ditch was filled so that it was possible to make an entrance through the wall very quickly. On our part, we feared only that the Saracens would set fire to the machines that were moved close to the walls, and thus improve their situation. So on both sides it was a night of watchfulness, labour, and sleepless caution. On one side, most certain hope, on the other doubtful fear. We gladly laboured to capture the city for the glory of God, and they less willingly strove to resist our efforts for the sake of the laws of Mohammed. It is hard to believe how great were the efforts made on both sides during the night. When the morning came, our men rushed to the walls and dragged the machines forward, but the Saracens had constructed so many machines that for each one of ours they now had 9 or 10. Thus they greatly interfered with our efforts. This was the 9th day on which the priest had said that we would capture the city. But why do I delay so long? Our machines were now taken apart by the blows of many stones, and our men lagged because they were very weary. However, there remained the mercy of the Lord, which is never overcome or unconquered, but is always a source of support in times of adversity. One incident must not be omitted. 2 women tried to bewitch one of the hurling machines, but a stone struck and crushed them, as well as 3 slaves, so that their lives were extinguished and the evil incantations averted. By noon, our men were greatly discouraged. They were weary, and at the end of their resources. There were still many of the enemy opposing each one of our men. The walls were very high and strong, and the great resources and skill of the enemy exhibited in preparing their defences seemed too great for us to overcome. But while we hesitated, irresolute, and the enemy exulted in our discomfiture, the healing mercy of God inspired us and turned our sorrow to joy, for the Lord did not forsake us. While a council was being held to decide whether or not our machine should be withdrawn, for some were burned and the rest were badly shaken to pieces, a knight on the Mount of Olives began to wave his shield to those who were with the Count and others, signalling them to advance. Who this knight was we have been unable to find out. At this signal our men began to take heart, and some began to batter down the wall, while others began to ascend by means of scaling ladders and ropes. Our archers shot burning firebrands, and in this way checked the attack that the Saracens were making upon the wooden towers of the Duke and the 2 Counts. These firebrands, moreover, were wrapped in cotton. This shower of fire drove the defenders from the walls. Then the Count quickly released the long drawbridge which had protected the side of the wooden tower next to the wall, and it swung down from the top, being fastened to the middle of the tower, making a bridge over which the men could enter Jerusalem bravely and fearlessly. Among these who entered first were Tancred and Duke of Lorraine, with the amount of blood that they shed on the way incredible. All ascended after them, and the Saracens now began to suffer. Strange to relate, however, that at this very time, when the city was practically captured by the Franks, the Saracens were still fighting on the other side, where the Count was attacking the wall as though the city could never be captured. But now that our men had possession of the walls and towers, wonderful sights were to be seen. Some of our men, and this was more merciful, cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows so that they fell from the towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses. But these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon, a place where religious services were ordinarily chanted. What happened there? If I tell the truth, it will exceed your powers of belief. So let it suffice to say this much, at least, that in the temple and the porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. The city was filled with corpses and blood. Some of the enemy took refuge in the Tower of David, and petitioning Count Raymond for protection, surrendered the tower to his hands. Now that the city was taken, it was well worth all our previous labours and hardships to see the devotion of the pilgrims at the Holy Sepulchre. How they rejoiced and exulted and sang a new song to the Lord, for their hearts offered prayers of praise to God, victorious and triumphant, which cannot be told in words. A new day, new joy, new and perpetual gladness, the consummation of our labour and devotion, drew forth from all new words and new songs. This day, I will say, will be famous in all future ages, for it turned our labours and sorrows into joy and exultation. This day, I say, marks the justification of all Christianity, the humiliation of paganism, and the renewal of our faith. The massacre in Jerusalem spared few. Jews were burnt inside their synagogue. Muslims were indiscriminately cut to pieces, decapitated or slowly tortured by fire, this on Christian evidence. Such was the scale and horror of this carnage that one Jewish witness was reduced to noticing approvingly that at least the Christians did not rape their victims before killing them, as Muslims did. The city was comprehensively ransacked. Gold, silver, horses, food, the domestic contents of houses were seized by the conquerors in a pillage as thorough as any in the Middle Ages. Profit vied with destruction. Some Jewish holy books were later ransomed to the surviving community in exile. Violence overcame business on the 16th of July, when Tancred's prisoners in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were butchered in cold blood, possibly by Provençals who had missed the previous day's action, people from a different region of France. The city's narrow streets were clogged with corpses and dismembered body parts, including some crusaders crushed in their zeal for the pursuit and massacre of the defenders. The heaps of the dead presented an immediate problem for the conquerors. On the 17th of July, many of the surviving Muslim population were forced to clear the streets and carry the bodies outside the walls to be burnt in great pyres, whereat they themselves were massacred, a chilling pre-echo of later genocidal practices. This secondary slaughter, in cold blood, perhaps even more than the initial mayhem, provoked mounting retrospective shock and outrage amongst Muslim intellectuals, religious leaders and politicians, over the next century and a half. Some thousands, men, women and children, were massacred, although certainly fewer than the 70,000 trumpeted in early 13th century Arabic chronicles. A few Muslim and Jewish Jerusalemites survived, managing either to escape, sometimes with their possessions and holy books, such as the belongings of the Egyptian garrison and its hangers-on, the Torah scrolls that reach Ascalon, or to be ransomed, a process that could take months, suggesting a not entirely indiscriminate policy of killing on the part of the Crusaders.
Phenomenal, you wish you were. I am the best I ever been. I tried to be the best of men. You know. Some support by my side could have been